Hear the word of the Lord from John 20:11 through 18. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was a gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave them his message. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. My name is Bobby. I'm one of the pastors here. Peace be with you. This is my first time to preach since we started a Bible fellowship a few months ago. Normally I lead the 9 a.m. Bible fellowship along with Deacon Lindsay some weeks, other weeks Deacon Meg or Kristen, and it's become one of my favorite parts of each week. The hour just flies by when we're talking about the Bible together. One of the things that I hope that it does for me, and that I hope that it does for those of you who are attending that, who aren't serving our kids at that time, is hopefully I live a few more decades, and I want to be able to look back on my life. And among the many different things I hope I can look back on, I want to be able to say that week in, week out, year in, year out, I gathered with a group of people from my church and talked about the Bible together in an open, interactive discussion. What would that do to form me over years? What would that do to form us together? So I invite you all that aren't already attending next Sunday, 9 a.m., join us across the hall in Bible fellowship before you come here for the 11 o'clock service. Whether it's Bible fellowship or Sojourn Kids or Fresh Stop Market, whatever we do, we exist to reach people with the gospel, to build them up as God's church, and then send them wherever God leads to be champions of truth, beauty, and goodness. And when we think about truth, beauty, and goodness, especially at Eastertide, we think of the resurrection of Christ and what that means for our own future and for this world. But if it's really true, if it's not just a fairy tale, then where is Jesus when I'm anxious, when I'm lonely, when I feel inadequate or afraid? Does he really want me? And if he wants me, am I just a charity case? Would he really invest in me? Would he really entrust me with meaningful work in his kingdom? And if you've been a Christian for long, you know the answers to these questions intellectually. I know them in my head. I don't always feel them in my heart. Today we meet a woman who had every right to ask these questions. Her name was Mary Magdalene, and we may find God's answers to us in his answer to her. We meet her at her darkest hour, Sunday morning following the crucifixion of her Lord, her teacher, her friend. She has gone to his tomb, which was a cave in a garden. John 20, verse 11. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. Mary is one of several women who had traveled with Jesus and the other disciples. The gospel writer Luke says, chapter 8, verse 2, among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, Susanna, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus. Mary is a woman of means with a troubled past. Numbers in Bible times were assigned meaning. So when we see the number 7 in Scripture, it symbolizes completion. Whatever was going on with Mary's health, with her body or mind, we are meant to understand that she was in complete control of demonic forces, or they were in control of her completely. before Jesus came, but he healed her. And he brought her in as a disciple. He equipped and trained her. Now he's dead and Mary is crushed. She's come to the garden tomb and discovered the body is missing. Do you ever find yourself asking, where is Jesus? I need him. I'm lonely. Mary did too. She only expected to find a corpse, but she was desperate to honor it. Mary's hopes had been crushed on Good Friday. She didn't yet understand Jesus as the seed of the woman foretold in the first book of the Bible, who would crush the serpent's head, righting everything that had been wrong with the world since the first woman and man followed the spiritual forces of this world instead of God, setting the trajectory for all of humanity. Verse 13, "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." Others in the Gospel of John have called Jesus Lord, but Mary is the first to say, "My Lord." This is personal. Have you ever felt that way? At one time, you thought you knew Jesus. You thought you were close to Jesus, but it's like someone has taken him away and you don't know where they have put him. We often don't recognize him when he does come to us. Verse 14, "She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. 'Dear woman, why are you crying?' Jesus asked her. 'Who are you looking for?' She thought he was the gardener. 'Sir,' she said, 'if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him.' She thought he was the gardener. And he was. He was the maker of every garden. At the dawn of time, he had planted one in Eden. And along with the man, he had placed a woman like Mary in that garden. That woman, loaded with shame after having been deceived by the serpent, hid from God in a garden. Now, ages later, the woman Mary searches in a garden and cannot see that God is right before her eyes. Our minds have a way of overlooking what we don't expect to see, even if we long to see it. Whenever you hear people say that the resurrection story is just a bunch of ancient superstitious people who are believing what they wanted to believe, remember that no one in the first century Roman Empire thought that someone could come back to life after having been in their grave for 3 days. Yet Christ appears to those who seek him, often when we least expect him. Verse 16, "Mary," Jesus said. He calls her by name. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni." Rabboni is the combination of the word rabbon with the suffix, that little I at the end, which means my. So rabbon, teacher, my. Rabboni, my teacher. This word rabbon was the highest title of respect for a teacher in this culture, yet was also a less formal word, more personal word than the term rabbi, which other people use to refer to Jesus. My teacher. It is more significant than you know that Mary can say this. To see what this reveals about God's character and his plans for you, no matter how unqualified you feel or how others feel about you, we need to take a quick detour into a story with another Mary and her sister Martha before the death of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 38. Martha welcomed him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." I'm sure you've heard sermons or read devotionals where the application was, be a Mary, not a Martha. Jesus doesn't want you to get busy. He wants you to worship. And that's a fine application, but there is something deeper that's going on here. The historical and cultural setting reveals something deeper. This, for those of you that are in Bible fellowship, this is where we talk about the world behind the text. When we look at archaeology and history to tell us something about what was going on in the culture in which the Bible was written. Martha was doing what women were supposed to do in that culture. Mary was not. This phrase, sitting at the feet, was an idiom for attending class, studying, taking the posture of a student, a disciple. It was almost unheard of for Jewish rabbis to take on female students, nor were females taught to recite scripture like males were. Women could go to synagogue, but it wasn't their place to receive intensive training from a teacher of the law. It wasn't Mary's place to sit in class with Peter, Andrew, and Thomas. But the University of Jesus doesn't only admit male students. He says, Martha, we can wash our own cups. Come to class. Thomas, Bartholomew, scoot over. Martha's going to get in here. So when Mary Magdalene calls Jesus Rabboni, my teacher, she's not only recognizing him, but she is recognizing her own identity and calling in light of what he says is true about her. He is teacher and she is student, called to testify of a life transformed by Jesus. Admitting women as disciples was controversial enough, but remember Mary's past. The gospel writer Mark reminds us in his resurrection account. Mark chapter 16, verse 9. After Jesus rose from the dead early on Sunday morning, the first person who saw him was Mary Magdalene, the woman from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Is this the kind of person you entrust with an important message? Women weren't even considered reliable witnesses to give legal testimony in the first century, according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus. And, this is a great evidence for the resurrection, or an apologetic for the resurrection. If the gospel writers were making this story up, they would not have written a daughter of Eve as the primary witness. It lacked credibility in that culture. And Eve had only been deceived by one serpent. What about a woman who'd been oppressed by 7 demons? What do you think her reputation must have been in that community? And Jesus could have appeared first to Peter and John. That would have made more sense. It would have been more credible in that time. When Mary originally came to the tomb and found it empty, she ran back and told them, and they ran to the tomb to check it out, to verify her story. John 20, verse 6. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. They found the tomb empty and even believed. And then they went home. Does that strike anyone as a little odd? Maybe the conversation between them went something like this. Peter says, John, this is amazing. And John says, stupendous, Peter. And Peter says, I'm so happy. And John says, so happy. And Peter says, yeah. Well, getting to be about lunchtime. They just leave. Now, I'm having a little fun. I'm sure they weren't thinking about lunch. The Gospel of Luke says Peter left perplexed, wondering what had happened. But the point is, they're there. Jesus is there. He could have leaped out from behind a tomb and said, here I am. And then he probably would have had to raise 2 more people from the dead. But they're right there, and Jesus waits. He appears first to Mary. Verse 17. Don't cling to me, Jesus said, for I haven't yet ascended to the Father." Matthew's gospel tells us that Mary had thrown her arms around his feet, worshiping him. Jesus isn't worried that the force of her embrace is going to stop what happens next. He's saying she has a part to play in what happens next. "But go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." At the dawn of time, the first woman made in God's image had been exiled from a garden along with her husband. Now once more, God meets a woman in a garden, and once more he sends her out. This time, not in exile, but to announce the exile is over. Christ the Lord has risen from the grave with the keys to death and hell, and he entrusts to a daughter of Eve the first announcement: he is risen. Not only did Jesus want her, he took her into his confidence. Mary and all the disciples were going to be the next act in God's big drama. Act 1 was a good creation. Act 2 took a horrible turn when we rebelled against God in a garden, succumbed to spiritual powers when they came calling, and tried to overthrow God at the Tower of Babel. He exiled the nation, separating us from each other and leaving us at the mercy of the spiritual powers we thought we wanted. In Act 3, God chose one people group to covenant with him and lead all nations back to his kingdom, but they were no more faithful than the rest. Act 4 climaxed when this God became human, entered the genealogy of this people, kept their covenant perfectly, absorbed the sins of the world, and sacrificed himself for those sins, robbing hell of its power. He rose from the dead and is going to ascend to his throne. And he will continue to work in Act 5 through the church, which doesn't replace the Jewish people, but welcomes all others. This new family will be filled by the Spirit so they can be Christ's body on this earth, participating together in his work to reconcile all people to God and to each other. This is how we batter down the gates of hell. But none of us can do our thing until Mary does her thing. Verse 18. Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." And she gave them his message. If Jesus can welcome a woman with 7 demons into his family and he can send her on mission, what could he do for you? What could he do through you? But please understand, what's wonderful about Jesus isn't that he's just so nice to use someone of no value. Society didn't see her value. Society devalued Mary because of her past and her position. We devalue people like Mary. Jesus will have none of it. All of us are marred by sin, but God knows what he created us to be, and he can mend the broken pieces. He sees the value in what he made, which is proven by the high cost he paid to make us whole. He did it for Mary. He can do it for you. And he has designed us to need each other. Jesus doesn't need us. Jesus wants us. We need each other. The church needed Mary Magdalene. And just like the church needed Mary, the church needs you. We need your presence. We need your voice. We need you in all the ways God may have gifted and equipped you to represent him as his image bearer. So with that in mind, I have one question for you to pray about and think about in my Monday challenge to you. What would you do if you were convinced that Jesus wants you and your church needs you? How would you show up for the people in your life? How would you handle that voice in your head that's whispering lies about your self-worth? How might you encounter Jesus in the here and now if your heart was bursting with the wonder of his love for you? Now, don't think too hard about this. What pops into your mind? What would you start doing? Maybe what would you stop doing? If you were convinced that Jesus wants you and your church needs you. Think about that this week. Think about this tomorrow. Christ has a place for you no matter who you are and what you've done. This family isn't complete until the last one is seated at the table. And until his visible return, each week at the table, we see him in the most commonplace of objects, a loaf of bread, a cup of wine. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took a loaf of bread like this one, and after giving thanks, he broke it. And he said, "This is my body broken for you." Then he took a cup of wine like this one. And he said, "This is my blood shed for you. Drink this in remembrance of me until I come again."